So I just want to check that our participants on Zoom can hear us. Raymond, can you hear us? And the person whose name is Mike, can you hear
yes,
us all right?
I can hear you, thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, I think everyone's here who needs to be here, so we'll get this hearing underway. Hearing number 18 for signs. And the first submitter on our list this morning is Go Media. Good morning to the Go Media representatives and welcome. I think you've appeared before us before, so you know the drill. Thank you for the pre-circulated material which we've read. You don't need to read that out loud to us, but you are, of course, welcome to highlight key points. And if you've tabled additional material which we haven't seen before, then our preference is for that to be read out to us word for word. And if there's going to be any interpolation, that be clearly signalled so we know exactly what the evidence is before us. But other than that, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora, nai te mihi kei te mana whenua, ko Alex Booker tuku ingoa. So I'm here today on behalf of Go Media, Miss Booker, and with me I've got Mr. Michael Gray, who is on Zoom, and Mr. David Compton-Moen, who is beside me. Mr. Compton-Moen has pre-circulated his expert urban design evidence, and he has made a note of your comments around just speaking to those. Mr. Gray will be speaking from an industry non-expert perspective, and he has actually prepared some notes, and I will ask you, Mr. Gray, to follow instructions as you prepare in terms of reading those out and noting when you are making additional comments. So in terms of the Go Media case, Go Media is the largest independent outdoor media provider in New Zealand, and the submission that they've made has focused on the consenting requirements, namely the rules in terms of reducing the complexity for those areas or zones which are considered less sensitive across Selwyn district. So digital advertising is well known. It's common now. It's a more sustainable form of advertising, and the position of Go Media is the effects are also well known and controlled consistently up and down the country. So we'll be asking you to consider some changes to the plan, which include those standard provisions as a sort of a starting point to provide both certainty to applicants, but also for the community, so that you're not having a reporting officer just have a broad general discretion to think about whatever matters might be appropriate every single time. So it's reducing that complexity and the creating more efficiency in the plan process. I've set out just at paragraph 5 of submissions for Go Media that we have refined. It was quite a broad submission that was lodged, and we have refined that to be signage in those zones which are considered less sensitive, being specifically general industrial, large format retail, town centre and the knowledge. Now you'll notice that Mr. Compton-Moen has even addressed that more broadly in terms of commercial mixed use zones, but we've refined that down to the town centre zone, which would be essentially Rolleston and in very limited parts of Lincoln. Because of the rules surrounding that, it would practically not apply in many places. In terms of the being a business activity, I just wanted to note here, I mean, Selwyn District Council is a Tier 1 council. It is the only council, along with the other greater council partnership in the South Island, that's been identified, for example, for the intensification provisions under the Enabling Act. So what we are going to have here is a city that will be built to scale, and we can see that throughout the other provisions in the plan, that we're not just talking about a small town. There is going to be an element of scale, and this, what we're doing today and what you're doing, is foreseeing this essentially the next 10 years of what could be occurring in the district and providing for some certainty and provisions around that. Currently, digital signage hasn't been considered at all as a separate rule. It's sort of been lumped into what Mr. Gray will, I think, rigorously oppose as a distracting feature. And so what we're looking for is some recognition beyond that. I also acknowledge that we are appearing today with another submitter who has looked at some controlled provisions for some more discrete elements across the road there in terms of the port zone, the general industrial and the large format retail. And Go Media, while supportive, obviously, of that, is seeking a permitted standard for the digital signage aspects as opposed to off-site signage generally. So I guess it's a more specific relief than what has been sought through those submissions, but they are supported generally by Go Media. In terms of the plans and what you've got before you, largely the framework is already there within the signage chapter. It acknowledges and one of the first objectives in terms of the enabling of contributing to economic and community wellbeing. The policies themselves are relevant and applicable. Go Media suggested just some tweaks to sign P5 in terms of going to that permitted status, just acknowledging that it can be managed, the effects, and ultimately the avoid off-site signs in residential rural zones will be given effect too, because we're not intending to put a permitted activity status for a sign that could be seen or visible from those zones. It's really quite limited to the areas built up in the town centre or the industrial zone. What I'm intending to do today is I was going to go now to Mr. Gray to talk more generally from an industry perspective, then to Mr. Compton-Moen. And because we are without a planner in our team, I will then walk through what has been proposed in the provisions, if that would assist you. Otherwise, be available to answer questions around those particular provisions, if that suits you.
Yeah, I'll just see if we have any questions for you initially. Lindsay, any questions from the legal submissions? No. Raywin, any questions arising from the legal submissions?
No, thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a couple. Just in your para 7 and the 5th line, and you mentioned in your verbal, you say some tweaks are proposed to sign P5. Did you mean sign R5?
No, sign P5 is the policy. So if you go to Appendix 1 and look under the heading Sign Objectives and Policies, sign P5 says avoid off-site signs in residential and rural zones, and then it said ensure off-site signs are compatible, and I've just said provide for off-site signs where they're compatible. So they are the tweaks just to enable that permitted in limited circumstances. My submission would be that it doesn't change the nature and intention of that provision.
And I noticed that in your legal submissions, in terms of sign R5, the text in blue is not the notified provisions, are they? They're the provisions sought by another submitter.
Yeah, so what I've sought to do is
because... Just wait for the question.
Oh,
so,
sorry.
I don't think you were a further submitter on that submitter, were you?
No.
So what scope do we have to consider the relief you've now put before us?
So the relief that we've put before you falls squarely within the Go Media submission, which is to enable provisions for signage in the district. But that blue is to retain the same structure because they're submitting for a controlled activity status on signage generally. So that would apply to billboards that are both static and digital. Whereas what we're seeking here is digital signage. And the reason I've retained that structure is if you were to accept both relief sought, it would be presented in a similar manner. I've been trying to be of assistance. My submission would be that when you look at the relief sought in the submission, we're seeking that we're seeking specifically that we should recognise positive effects, that off-site related digital advertising should be separately listed permitted activity in the provisions, subject to compliance with rule requirements which reflect industry standards. So that simply gives complete effect to that request.
So that's submission point 003.
I'm just looking at the original submission,
Right,
but it's
okay.
that paragraph 8C of the original submission.
Yeah.
But yeah, I acknowledge that would be confusing to you. What I was trying to do is not to have you have two completely separate types of structure of rules that you'd be considering today.
Right. And so the specific nature of what you're asking us to put into sign R5 and then the new sign REQX, was that specific wording included in the submission?
No, it wasn't.
Right.
It was included in the sense that we said consistent with other signage rules, subject to compliance with rule requirements which reflect industry size requirements where compliance cannot be achieved, and it's referred to the Christchurch City Plan District rules, which are these.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, just in terms of that specific wording in your appendix, you're asking us to, and I'm looking now at sign REQ6.
REQ6, yes.
Distracting features, and you're asking us to, from clause C, remove the words digital or LED displays.
Correct.
If we were to consider that favourably, what would then changing images relate to? The words that would be retained in your submission.
That's a very good point, sir, and we would seek to remove that as well.
So you're now asking us to consider striking out all of clause C.
I think yes, or the other alternative, which may be more appropriate and what has occurred in other district plan processes we've been involved in, is to enable that digital LED display word to be retained in that particular provision. For example, it might apply to a road sign which has a digital element to it, but make clear in the digital signage rules that that particular sign REQ6 doesn't apply. So if you have a look, and that's already done in terms of sign R5 offsite signs, where we've said, and the activity complies with the following rule requirements, and it refers to digital signage and traffic safety and does not refer to the distracting features. That was an afterthought that I had when I reflected on that this morning. I think ultimately, as long as it's clear that it doesn't apply to digital signs, I accept that there may be road signs, for example, which I drove past this morning, where it has the orange words on it, so it could become relevant for other signage.
So just in light of all of that, what are you now asking us to do with REQ6?
We can just strike out that relief sort.
So
because it doesn't apply to the rule, we've made it clear that REQ6 is not to be considered with digital signage.
So no change now sought to REQ6.
Correct.
Okay. All right, well, thanks very much for clarifying those two matters. I think we can hear from Mr. Gray now.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm just going to read some evidence which I don't believe has been tabled yet, and I will advise if I sort of depart from that to make additional comments as we go along. My name is Michael Aaron Gray. I'm the Managing Director of Go Media Limited. We have an office based in Christchurch, and I've been in the out-of-home industry since 1994, when I rented my first billboard in Christchurch. By way of background, Go Media is a nationwide out-of-home advertising company. We have 450 static billboards and 665 buses nationwide. We currently operate 70 LED digital billboards nationally. We have LED digital billboards located in Hamilton, Auckland, Tauranga, New Plymouth, Hastings, Gisborne, Palmerston North, Levin, Otaki, Masterton, Wellington, Nelson, Christchurch and Dunedin. And just an additional comment, we've also added Invercargill, Timaru is about to go live. We've put one up in Porirua, Upper Hutt and Petone recently. We purchase quality hardware and pay a generous land lease to the landlord. We sell advertising to local businesses, community events and major brands. Nationally, we sponsor organisations such as Netball New Zealand, New Zealand Football, and every Super Rugby team. Just to make another comment there. So within the Canterbury region, we sponsor the Crusaders, the Tactics, Canterbury Cricket, both the men and women's team, the World Buskers Festival, International Comedy Festival. We do work with Tromley Children's Home, My Health Trust, Ronald McDonald House. So a big part of what we do as a company is we support those sports teams, events, art, culture within a community. And the beauty of digital billboards is they allow you essentially to splice up the screen time, where you can either give it away, donate it, or through a sponsorship agreement, provide it free of charge. But that's quite unique in terms of how we operate as a company, but that's what we do in each market. I've worked closely with the various councils throughout New Zealand, including through proposed plan processes with regard to erecting signage and having appropriate provisions in district plans. As a side comment, I probably have done more billboard resource consent applications than any other person in the country. And I'd say that probably over 400 in the last 29 years. So I'm always looking for rules that I think are practical and clear and well-meaning. Returning to the evidence, positive benefits of advertising. Digital advertising contributes to the commercial vitality of a community through supporting businesses, infrastructure and community activities. It is a legitimate commercial activity that generates economic activity by enabling the commercial community to advertise goods and services. Go Media spends millions of dollars each year within local communities with landowners, buses, bus companies, printers, installers, abseilers, engineers, planners, traffic engineers, traffic management companies, hire companies, solicitors and accountants. The events that we advertise help to successfully promote and contribute to economic, cultural and social well-being. We advertise messages about mental health, All Right campaign as an example, the environment, drinkable rivers, recycling messaging, and road safety with NZTA or Waka Kotahi. Along with advertising all the sports events, art galleries, music shows, comedy festivals and major events, this also adds to the cultural and social well-being of communities. I've donated millions of dollars of media over the last 20 years to charities and groups I choose to support simply because I believe you get what you give. Following the earthquakes, our Christchurch billboards were used extensively by the Earthquake Commission, Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, Enable and Christchurch City Council, which is one of our largest clients, to communicate important community messages and important information. Chapter 18, signs. Off-site signs are currently proposed to be discretionary activities in all zones except all residential zones and general rural zone where they will be non-complying activities. Go Media submitted on Chapter 18 of the proposed Selwyn District Plan, seeking provision for digital billboards where they meet industry standards in the less sensitive zones across Selwyn. We have refined this relief to seek more permissive rules for billboards in the following zones: the general industrial zone, large format retail zone, town centre zone, and the knowledge zone. Just to depart from the evidence, my thinking around the knowledge zone is that universities across the country are seeking alternative revenue streams and communication tools. So there's a possibility that a commercial relationship could be had within that knowledge zone with the operator, where some digital signage could be used, where it could be creating a commercial revenue stream for them in terms of rental from someone like myself, but it's also got the ability to communicate messages that they want to all the students within the zone. Returning to the evidence, we have industry standards which apply to digital billboard sizes and operations. The industry standards are not proposed to be set out in the proposed plan to control effects, leaving the assessment to the reporting officers at council each time a consent is applied for. It is concerning that off-site signs are presumed to have additional environmental effects when compared with site-related signage. Often digital advertising provides for a mix of both off-site and on-site advertising. I will now explain the rationale from an operator's perspective behind each of the following proposed permitted standards. The maximum area of a single billboard shall be 18 square metres. In the case of two-sided billboards, the area shall be calculated as being that visible from one direction only, provided that such billboards are joined at the apex and are separated by an angle of 30 degrees or less. The maximum height shall be 9 metres. The site shall have a minimum road frontage of 40 metres per billboard, provided that no more than 2 billboards may be erected on any single site. Location is key for signage, and signs will not be located on the same site as an activity to avoid visual clutter. Each billboard shall be subject to a written maintenance program undertaken by the operator provider and provided to and certified by the council. The billboard shall be located at least 50 metres from any signalised traffic intersection. The billboard shall result in no more than 10 lux spill, horizontal and vertical, of light when measured or calculated 2 metres within the boundary of any adjacent site and road. No live broadcast or pre-recorded video shall be displayed on the screen. Only still images shall be displayed within a minimum duration of 10 seconds. There shall be no movement or animation of the images displayed on the screen. The material displayed on the screen shall not contain any flashing images, and the screen itself shall not contain any retro-reflective material. There shall be no transitions between still images apart from cross-dissolve of a maximum of 0.5 seconds. There shall be no sound associated with the screen, and no sound equipment is to be installed as part of the screen. The screen shall incorporate lighting control to adjust brightness in line with ambient light levels. The consent holder shall submit a certification report from an independent lighting practitioner within 30 days following the commencement of the display going live, confirming that the requirements of this condition are met. In the event of digital screen failure, the billboard screen shall either default to black or switch off. The billboard should not exceed the following lumens levels. For daytime, 5,500 candela per square metre maximum, and nighttime 250 candela per square metre maximum, and 150 candela per square metre maximum average. Only digital billboards, off-site digital signage, which can't be seen from a rural or residential zone or State Highway 1, is proposed to be permitted. Distracting features. The proposal plan also seeks to include LED and digital displays under a rule requirement for distracting features. It should be recognised that digital signage can be programmed to display only static images, and the dwell time between images is also able to be controlled. It is not accurate or fair to place digital signage in the category of distracting features. Digital billboards attract, but do not distract. Just to talk to that a little more away from the evidence. The distracting features to me sounds a little bit like predetermination, whereas for me the beauty of a digital billboard is from an environmental point of view, one sign can be used by many as opposed to having many signs. And essentially the way the digital sign operates, we run 6 advertisers in a loop that just plays over for a week as a rule of thumb. Sometimes we might cut up one slot into 4 smaller quarter slots, and that would be shared across charities or a local school play, for example, where we might be donating time. So the beauty of a digital sign is that it can be, multiple advertisers can use the one sign rather than having a proliferation of signs. And you're not having to produce PVC vinyl skins which don't biodegrade. So there are a lot of benefits with digital signs. So the traffic evidence is that, yes, they attract people's attention, but they don't distract. So I suppose I'm just trying to, I look at that and go, well, that sounds like a very negative way of looking at what we do. In terms of conclusion, digital advertising provides a sustainable alternative to print signage and is an accepted and commonplace form of advertising, especially in less sensitive areas such as industrial and commercial locations. Go Media seeks that the proposed plan expressly provide for digital signage in the Selwyn district. And just to break away from the evidence, the commercial reality for us is that these signs are very expensive. The screens, especially, then the steel structure, the foundations. And so there has to be a very compelling commercial a reason to want to put one up in terms of a return on investment. And so the reality for the Selwyn district, for me as an operator, that, you know, I might be looking to put maybe a maximum of 3 of these type signs within the district, in terms of, you know, the number of eyeballs, the size of these commercial locations. They're not that big, so there is some sort of natural limiting factors to this. So really, we're just looking for the ability that we could operate, you know, a legitimate business activity within the appropriate zones, with controls that have pretty much been adopted across the country in different district plans, that as an operator, and we know we can meet. But there are economic barriers to putting these signs up, so it's not going to lead to a proliferation in the district, I suppose, is the point I'm trying to make. And just to the last point in my conclusion is, it is possible to control the effects of digital signs through requirements and plan without going through an uncertain, time-consuming and expensive resource consent process every time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. That's very clear. Now, to see if we have any questions for you. Mark, any questions?
Yes, thank you. I have a number. Mr. Gray, is your company focused solely on the large billboards? You don't have sort of smaller ones that you might see within a shopping precinct?
There was one company in New Zealand called O-Media, Australian company. They have all the bus shelter screens, which are what we call small format that you might see around in Christchurch. They have a digital version of those screens, and they also do, say, Westfield shopping malls, those, you know, largest shopping malls, and they kind of specialise in that. As a company, we're about to put some across the Greater Wellington train network. We have a contract with Greater Wellington Regional Council through Metlink. So they're going to be the first digital signs of a small format size. So we are actually venturing into that, I suppose, that size. Traditionally, billboards, the standard size, or the minimum standard size, was 18 square metres, 6 metres by 3, either portrait or landscape. Billboards are now 8 by 4s, 12 by 3s, another common format, and then there's the spectaculars, which are larger again. And what we're proposing here is the smallest size of a billboard, which is 18 square metres.
Thank you. I mean, it's just I'm struggling to see in Selwyn, if you're not on the highways, you're not in the visible from the highways, rural zones, residential zones, where they might be placed. I'm trying to put them in context of them. So that's a useful answer. Thank you.
Well, if I could respond to that, sir. Yes, I think that's the point, that the opportunities are going to be quite limited in terms of when you factor in all those components you just said. You know, and then you've also got to have a willing landlord. There could be landlords that are not interested in having a sign on their property as well. So all those constraints mean that, in my opinion, there wouldn't be a proliferation of this type of signage. There's lots of hurdles to get across to even want to put one up or to apply for a consent.
Okay, and from your evidence, these digital billboards essentially turn themselves down during the hours of darkness. They dim themselves. Am I reading that correctly?
That is correct, sir. And they actually dim themselves constantly throughout the day. So every minute, it's an automated control system within the screen. It is basically checking the light levels. So as on a really bright sunny day where you're competing with the sun, the screen will actually brighten itself to compete with the sun. But if it's overcast or it's cloudy, the sign will dim itself down. So it's an automated process constantly happening seamlessly throughout the day based on ambient light levels. So, and the change isn't immediate. It might recognise that it should start to dim itself down, and then over the next minute, it will slowly start to do that. So yeah, the screens are actually automatically dimming themselves. And so we put that in as a condition of the rules we're suggesting. That's because there have been some screens installed early on that didn't have that inbuilt control mechanism.
Thank you. And the issue of distraction versus attraction, isn't that a semantic issue? I mean, particularly from a driving point of view, if something attracts your attention, it's inherently distracting your attention from your driving. I mean, I'm not going to quibble too much over this, but it's a spectrum, and so something that attracts you must distract you from what you were doing.
Yeah, well, I take your points there. I'm not a traffic expert, but I've been in a lot of hearings with traffic experts, and I suppose the argument is that as you're driving along, you might get attracted to some goings on the footpath, someone running, dogs, animals. You know, you can get attracted or distracted by lots of things, but from a road safety point of view, where arguments have been made that they distract in a negative way, the argument is that yes, you're attracted to something, you look at the sign, but it's not distracting you to the point where suddenly you're not operating the vehicle in an appropriate manner. That's, I suppose, the key difference.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's the end of my questions.
Thank you. Raymond, any questions?
No, I've had everything clarified. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lindsay, any questions for Mr. Gray?
Thank you for your evidence. Obviously, your business is around getting people to look at your signs. And so there's an economic case that you need to work out for yourself in terms of the investment which is required to put a digital sign up. They can cost lots of money, I expect, and will require maintenance and so forth. But in terms of the rules that we're looking at here, or being proposed by Go Media, they seem fairly limited because in terms of the permitted activity, in that they relate to the general industrial zone, and in Selwyn, the general industrial zone, the largest one is obviously in Wollaston, but there's pockets in Leaston and the various other Starfield and other townships as well. So I guess my question is, how are you going to get people to look at your signs if they're not going to be pointing at traffic, or they're not in a town centre location which have a number of pedestrian movements?
Just to, before I answer the second part of the question, sir, yeah, so when you read the rules, you know, you've got road frontage requirements, distance from intersections, and these are kind of standard, like this is in the Christchurch plan, for example, so that to be a permitted activity, there are lots of things you need to meet. And so that by virtue of itself does limit the number of opportunities. And then, as you pointed out, the size of these zones aren't huge. So that again limits the opportunities. And then you must have a willing landlord who wants to receive the rent. So in a practical sense, they are quite, whilst we're seeking a permitted activity status, and we've defined some rules that control the activity that we think are appropriate, it does limit the options that are available. And so I suppose that's my point with, I can't see a proliferation of signage. Now, we might not be able to meet those rules. We might find a location that's in the zone, but they don't have 40 metres of road frontage, they might only have 20. It might be 35 metres from an intersection. And so whilst it meets a large portion of the rules, it doesn't meet them all, so it's not permitted. So therefore a consent would be required and assessments would need to be made accordingly. So we're just looking for some rules that allow the activity to take place, that manage the nature of digital billboards and how you want to control light levels, how you don't want them visible from residential zones, etc. Traffic safety is being taken into account through distance from traffic signals. So that, and we're looking for more large scale properties that can accommodate a sign. So the rules are well intentioned, designed to factor in all the complexity of how we operate based on best practice across district plans throughout New Zealand. But yeah, the underlying point you make is correct. Just because it's a permitted activity, the rules are quite restrictive in terms of opportunities within the Selwyn district. So then it would be up to me to find a location that might work. And I don't, based on population and what my desires are, I'm saying 1 to 3 across those different centres.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. So in terms of what I think you're saying is to get you a viable site which is going to meet your business case for revenue, etc., those sorts of things. The limitations that there are within Selwyn would mean that you're probably going to be pointing towards a restricted discretionary activity for a site like that anyway. So why have most likely? So why have a permitted activity rule if it's very unlikely to be used?
Well, because if I can meet them, like the port zone within Rolleston, that's very large. I could imagine you could meet the rules there. So that would.
Where's okay? Just on there, where are the people that are going to be looking at that particular sign on the port zone in order for you to get an economic return off the sign?
Sure.
Are they coming on the state highway or?
Well, you know, there are obviously Rolleston has become the sort of I suppose the extension of Christchurch through the fact the land's suitable from, you know, earthquakes and stuff. So that is going to be the growth of Canterbury. Obviously that commercial hub there's lots of development of Costco's and all that going in. So there is I suppose within those large commercial zones that are starting to be developed now and over time are going to get bigger and bigger. Within that, you're going to find more people working within those environments or being drawn to them because they want to shop there. So it might not be right now, but maybe in 2 years, yes, there'll be enough audience to accommodate a sign like this, because it's really eyeballs that we require to sell to, you know. So yeah, obviously the intention is we want an audience to see the sign, see some adverts on it, and also community messaging or tell them what's going on in the community, and they're informed by that. So you definitely need eyeballs. But yeah, I think there'll be some places where it's permitted, but I suppose we're trying to put forward to you some rules that have constraints around them, so that it's not carte blanche, you know.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Minor matter in your evidence, you mentioned State Highway 1, your paragraph 12. There's other state highways in the district. Presume it's just state highways generally.
I think one in particular because of the speed limit. Waka Kotahi doesn't have an issue with digital billboards under, I think it's 70k speed limits on state highways. They have guidelines around, you know, dwell times and stuff like that, but their biggest concern is if it's at 100k speed limit.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. They also have quite a few controls over things like sign content, like preferences for no more than 6 words or characters on display, use of more recessive colours, if you like, as well. They certainly don't like signs which mimic traffic safety signs as well. So, yeah, I guess there's, if you're looking at a permitted activity rule, it needs to be very precise around what you're actually going to be looking to achieve in relation to whether it's going to be pointed at any state highway or not.
Yes, we've been working with them quite closely around some of those content things. So they've just updated their third version, addendum 3 of their guidelines, and they're well intentioned, but sometimes we've had some conditions imposed on us that from an operating point of view we could never meet. Because we don't create the content we display, For example, Vodafone, they will do a campaign that's across TV, newspaper, print, posters, bus shelters, buses, and it's all the same and the same number of words. And so they've come to accept that the key message needs to be big and simple. Sometimes if you're doing a sponsorship advertisement, say for the Crusaders, contractually they need to have different logos for their sponsors on it, and there's a logo on the jersey, and is that an image or is that a word? And so we've had to have these conversations with them to go, well, this is the intention and this is what it should say. And we're quite happy on the what you just said we could put forward some wording around content from a traffic safety point of view, because we've come up with some standard wording that Wellington City Council has adopted because of issues arising from how you interpret some of these rules and guidelines.
If I can just assist there, the permitted activity rule does also refer to that traffic safety rule, which talks about these aspects that we're accepting of in terms of the content.
REQ7.
Yeah, thank you. And if I can just say from a legal perspective, your point, Commissioner, is absolutely acknowledged, and that was discussed as a team before we came into this hearing and looked at maps. There are restricted opportunities. What these permitted standards do really help do is focus on the issues at hand when you're going for a consent application. Is it because you're breaching that, say, arbitrary 50-metre line to a traffic signal, and then there's a real focus on traffic safety, as opposed to allowing a reporting officer who may not have even dealt with one of these things before have a broad ranging. It does provide guidance, in my experience, on both sides of both the council and the applicant side for what might be considered an acceptable level of effects from a billboard.
And but the same would apply to static signs as it would apply to digital signs, wouldn't it?
Yes, correct. And what the focus of Mr. Gray has been is on digital signage, because that's kind of what they've evolved in. Yep. But you'll see that the Christchurch City Council, and it is within scope of what we've sought, and also what it's within scope of what the other submitters in this chapter have sought, is the Christchurch City Council actually does a permitted standard for both the static billboards and the digitals. How we've pitched things is, as Chair, you asked, in terms of we've tried to take the structure of what they were doing across the road in terms of having a controlled status which would apply to everything, and then we've said, well, actually, in these very specific circumstances around digital billboards, it would be permitted. So we've just tried to refine that further for the interests of Mr. Gray's business. Yeah. But we've.
If I could just add one thing, Alex. I had a lot of static signs in Christchurch. At one point, I would have had about 120. We've reduced the number of sites over the last 4 years. With the rise of digital, the static market has diminished in terms of people wanting them. Obviously, COVID had effects, but the fact when you can put up one digital sign, the way I put it is that many advertisers can use the one sign rather than putting up lots of individual signs. So we've actually been reducing the number of static signs we've had in Christchurch because the technology now allows us to, use one sign to help multiple people.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gray. No further questions from me, but thank you very much for your evidence. It's been very informative and helpful.
Thanks for your time.
Yep, next witness. Yep.
Thank you. My name's David Compton-Moen. I am an urban designer and landscape architect, the director of DCM Urban, which is a Christchurch design business. I've worked on a number of digital billboard applications and static as well for Go Media, and also some of Go Media's competitors. And I've worked on those in Christchurch predominantly, but also Dunedin, Ashburton, Wellington, and Auckland. I'll just quickly go through a summary of my evidence. Signages for conveying information for trade businesses, events, public notices, but it also forms part of the legibility of a place, the character, and it can create visual interest. The sensitivity of the receiving environment is critical, though, for assessing the magnitude of change that a sign will create on the existing character or amenity in a zone. In my view, this means that they can accommodate a more permissive activity status, i.e. where it's not a sensitive location, than where it is a sensitive location, such as a rural or residential area. There's no difference, in my opinion, from an urban design perspective and visual amenity between off-site and on-site advertising signage. I don't look at the content really. It's in my opinion, a sign is a sign really. The only concern is whether that could potentially lead to visual clutter and more signage. And so I think the view is really you should be looking at signage as a totality rather than trying to break it down in terms of its type of content. In terms of visual amenity, the difference between static and digital signage is considered negligible, with the exception of the transitions. These can be controlled through standards, which is common in Christchurch, and it's quite widely accepted as a method to do this. Digital billboards offer a greater control and level of accuracy than the traditional static signage, where potentially they may be lit by externally mounted lighting, and then you have no control over the glare or luminance. While the LED billboard will emit light, this will not be particularly obvious during the day when compared to a static billboard. The effects of an LED billboard may be more noticeable at night, depending on the luminance levels of the display. But as Mr. Gray's previously mentioned, these can be controlled. Often the receiving environments where they go into already have ambient light levels that are then higher than typical, and this might be due to traffic requirements or their public spaces from a SIPTED issue reasoning. And so these have an effect on how bright the signage actually perceived as being. Any concerns about the frequency of transition of images can be easily fixed by altering the dwell time between images. And that's probably the main issue that comes up on a lot of billboards. Whether it's a permitted activity or a restricted discretionary is really, it's a planning matter. But I'd just like to reiterate that I think there's a lot of sense where, as a non-sensitive environment, it's more permissive to allow businesses to operate for signage in general, because I do think it can add positively in some instances to these environments. And that's my evidence. I'm open to questions.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Mark, any questions?
Yes, thank you. Your paragraph 12, when you say there is no difference from an urban design perspective between on-site, off-site advertising content, and that other rules will control this. Can you just point to the other rules that you think will control this in the Selwyn environment?
So that in terms of the other rules will be the amount of signage that's potentially allowed on a building, or the amount of freestanding signs. So I'm really just trying to say that there is a site in the totality, there's a certain amount of signage that's permitted potentially, but whether that's off-site or on-site, from a visual point of view, I don't actually have an issue.
Okay, because from my perspective, Selwyn is a different environment from, say, Christchurch City, where it's heavily urbanised, and I might agree with you, and within Christchurch City, the difference between an on-site and an off-site signage might not matter. But in Selwyn, you're transitioning between urban, rural, and the proliferation of off-site signage in that rural environment does actually make a considerable difference to the amenity of that environment, whether they are digital or static billboards. In a rural environment, it makes quite considerable difference, the quantity and quality of that signage.
I definitely agree there. I think a rural environment is a sensitive environment, and so therefore it would be treated in terms of your signage. You would be looking at your signage differently to how you would be looking at it in a commercial area or an industrial.
So
area.
your comment about offsite and onsite is within the context of the town centre or the industrial business zones, not Selwyn as a whole.
Potentially, it's a good point. I'd go back to my argument that a sign is a sign, and what we're trying to do is avoid a proliferation or visual clutter of signage. If the sign is permitted under the other standards for on-site signage, from a visual point of view, if that content on that sign were to be off-site advertising, I would not assess it differently, because it's a sign's a sign. It could be that, I'm just trying to think of an example. You might have a tractor sales yard that has their commercial branding on a digital sign. They might advertise tractors on there, but they might also advertise something else on there. I purely look on it from a point of view whether you can see the sign and how it fits into that context. It may be that on-site signage is not appropriate for that rural environment.
The off-site signage.
No, sorry, the on-site signage, potentially, if it didn't meet those, if it didn't meet the standards in the district plan for that zone, because it is a sensitive environment.
Because what we've seen historically is a creep of off-site signage into the rural environment that's not related to the activity on that property, that is cumulatively sort of starts to lead to a deterioration in amenity values within that zone. And that's the point that I was trying to tease out when you're saying there's no difference between on-site and off-site. In that zone, I believe there certainly is, and it can have a cumulative effect. Someone with a large road frontage can see there's a potential opportunity for income from having signage along their road frontage, which has nothing to do with their primary activity.
No, I'd agree with that. That's my biggest concern too. That it can create opportunities that potentially may not have been there in the past, and that the rural and residential environments are different. I think in commercial areas and industrial, there's definitely no difference. I think you go through Compton-Moen, Christchurch, there's a number of digital signs that are behind shop windows that display the wares. A lot of them actually have movies and videos, which I'm not promoting in this, but they're showing on-site content. But there wouldn't be, when you're looking at that view of that building, if they had off-site advertising as well, it would just add to the character.
Okay, I think we should.
Sarah, if I can add, we aren't seeking to change in any way the words avoid off-site signs in residential and rural zones, which has been put forward in the Selwyn District Plan.
Thank you. And just again to tease out in your paragraph 14, when you say there's, in terms of visual amenity, no difference between static and digital signage, mostly within the Selwyn District, the static signage is not illuminated at night. I can think of only a couple of places, and they are actually probably in an industrial zone where there is lighting of signage. So again, that's within a context, your statement's correct, but it's not possibly so as correct across the broader Selwyn District. I'm just trying to.
Yeah, that could be true. I do know from Christchurch City that a lot of the billboards are externally lit, and so then if you have a white background on that billboard advertising, then the glare potentially is a lot higher than, say, an LED billboard. We've got that ability to control the luminance level,
but it is still within the context of a zone where where we're talking in terms of where we might expect digital signage rather than just broadly across the district.
Yes.
Thank you.
Lindsay.
Just a couple of things. You've used various examples in Christchurch of digital signs that you've been involved in, and some of them have a reference to residential visibility as well. Now, I'm not from Christchurch, but I think I know each of those. Aren't they pretty high traffic principal arterial roads? Very wide, and the separation distances between where a sign is and the residential is either across the road or somewhat distant.
Yes, sir. And I put those in there because I wanted to highlight that they obviously went through a consent process. I can't remember whether they're discretionary or restricted discretionary, but we did assess the effects on the residential households. Some were as close as 80 metres, but then we took into account the nature of that road, traffic lights, truck movements, the quality of that view, and then the orientation of the windows as well. So there was that protection there for those residents, and that it wasn't a permitted activity because it was visible from a residential area. And I still agree with that. If it is visible from a sensitive area, it should go through a tighter consent process.
And then just leading on from that, if you have a residential property which may look at it, how would you, in terms of district plan guidance, actually say that this is acceptable and this one isn't? What are the reasons? I know we've got the matters of discretion and so forth, but from an urban design perspective, what is acceptable and what isn't?
It really comes down to the site, and each one is slightly different.
Pretty hard to mitigate though, aren't they? If you've got a double-sided 6x3 digital sign, 9 metres high, and it'll be at the top of that 9 metres, you're not going to be able to screen it from residential
No, and I think
properties, are you?
my argument is that it's being able to see the sign is not necessarily a negative aspect. That view that you're viewing the sign and has to be taken as part of that composition or the quality of that view. Quite often, if you're looking into an industrial area or a commercial area, they may be of a low quality, and therefore the sign actually doesn't detract from that view. It's just part of that overall composition. So I think that that's the key part really, is having a look at that existing view, the quality of that existing view, and then how that sign sits within that composition.
So is it true that effects diminish with distance in terms of
yes,
residential occupiers, and what is something is right in your face, it's going to have a lot more effect on your level of amenity than if it is considerably further away.
Definitely. I typically find that over past 200 meters, the effects really fall away. It just becomes part of the overall view. Between 100 and 200, it becomes more noticeable, and then it's really in that, I wouldn't say Goldilocks zone, but it's the 0 to 100 where you're starting to. That's where the effects are, and whether they and that's when you need to look at that receiving environment and the character.
Well, one of the points that Ms. Booker said before was that purpose is really to take out any uncertainty from a decision maker, whether it be a council officer processing or a RMA commissioner and so forth. And in terms of structuring what those effects are, to give a lot more guidance and more certainty for the industry.
Yeah.
What I'm really trying to establish is, what is that point where effects are so significant that something should be declined, and how that can be built in to give that bit more specific guidance, rather than being something which is up to somebody's personal opinion, to actually give a lot more guidance.
Am I able to explain? So there are some arbitrary sort of lines. For example, the Christchurch City, different to what we've proposed here. We've said any visibility, is you're not permitted, whereas Christchurch City is 50 metres. So if you're within 50 metres, you need to be, if you are beyond 50 metres, you can be considered permitted beyond that, and then you'd need to be assessed if you're closer. Queenstown is the same, for 50 metres, I think is what we put in. But I think there's a strong flavour here, Commissioner, in this plan, and our client's quite aware of this, that with the policy which says, one, avoid off-site signs in those residential and rural, but also it says that any signs have to be compatible with the character and visual amenity values of the surrounding area, particularly where they're not visible from residential and rural. So there's a real strong flavour in the policies that as soon as you're visible, you're not really what's been anticipated from residential and rural zones. And then coupled with the fact that the rule we've proposed says that any visibility whatsoever takes you away from that permitted standards, I'd suggest is a lot stronger than other places where I've seen signs that may have an arbitrary 50 metres or 100 metres.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but in your scenario, perhaps here in Selwyn, look, sounds like you're going to be triggering resource consent anyway to get to a stage where you've got an economic site with lots of eyeballs at it.
There'll be some areas we've looked at that would be possible across the road over here, but you're right. If you got to Lincoln, for example, there would be maybe one or two spots where you could possibly get a permitted right in the town square with no visibility, say from the residential side. So it is quite limited. So your question is then, is there any way to provide additional guidance from an urban design perspective? And what Mr. Compton-Moen's been telling us is it's a site-specific assessment every time, really, isn't it? Based on, I guess, who the receiving people are in that residential.
Yeah, I think
with
so.
a strong policy flavour that it's not really appropriate. Yeah.
Okay. Final one, and it was leading on from previous questions about clutter and the differences between off-site signs and on-site signs. So if you've got a particular location which already has a couple of off-site signs on it, and somebody wants to put an on-site sign on it, and they get declined because there's already visual clutter, shouldn't the preference be for a sign which is on-site displaying the goods and services which are either produced or sold from that site, as opposed to say, buy these widgets at X place?
Yes, yeah, I agree. I guess that's the benefit of digital signage as well, is that you got that ability to.
Yeah, but whether it's digital or not digital doesn't really matter.
No,
I don't think. It's whether or not there should be a preference in terms of the signage, as there is to signage which actually displays the goods and services which are on that building or on that site, as opposed to something which is just there for selling product.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yes, I agree. We're trying to avoid clutter. I always just, in my assessments, try to avoid getting into the content argument and just treat a sign as a sign. The clutter is potentially the effect, but I think that could be mitigated by looking at the site as a totality.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And I'll just say that the intention of what is proposed here is that the minimum 40 metres and limit to billboards, and it wouldn't supersede if you were able to have a permitted on-site sign. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No further questions from me, thank you.
Thank you. And
Sorry,
I just want to
excuse
sorry,
me,
Raymond.
Commissioner.
Sorry, Raymond, I forgot about you. Any questions?
I was just about to
I
apologise.
I do have a question. Actually, Mr. Gray clarified a couple, so I only have one for you, Mr. Compton-Moen. At paragraph 18, you discuss numerous lighting sources contributing cumulatively to the overall ambient light level, which lessens the magnitude of change when using digital signs. You go on to say there will not be no additional adverse effects when comparing nighttime brightness or light spill to daytime levels. With regard to cumulative effects of glare or light spill, how would you manage these effects?
They can through the standards. So there's a number of condition of consent that quite often gets put on a billboard application, and that typically deals with any of those adverse effects as a way of managing those, in terms of the transitions, and there's the ability to control any potential effects. So I feel that as long as those standards are incorporated in somehow, or then there's that ability to ensure that the ambient light levels of an area don't increase.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. So no further questions for you, Mr. Compton-Moen, but just for you, Ms. Booker, it seems to me from your legal submissions, you're trying to kind of retrofit in a digital sign permitted activity rule into the relief sought by another submitter for signs generally. So what I'd like to do is give you leave, and I know you don't have a planner, but you seem to be able to draft rules because you've done that for us.
Or we could get a planner to do it.
What I'd give you leave to do is to come back to us with some standalone bespoke provisions that deal with digital signs, and so it doesn't conflate them with the relief sought by the next submitter for signs generally, and so we can see them as a standalone package, and then we can evaluate them. The reporting officers can evaluate them as a package, give us an option to look at.
No, and I think that's sensible. On reflection, I did, when I got your question this morning, I did think, while trying to be helpful, it probably did confuse things slightly.
Yeah.
So I take that point, and I will submit that today for you.
Submit it when, sorry?
Today.
Well, that's pretty prompt. Excellent.
Yeah, I'll pull it out, and I'll have a chat to the planner and put it out. Yeah.
So when you say that planner, which planner are you?
Oh, the usual planners that are used by
Okay.
Go Media that haven't been involved because it was taking rules that have already been formulated and drafted through another process.
Right. So if you're going to do that for us, maybe take a little bit longer than a day. And if you're going to get planning advice, if there's any commentary from that planner that would assist us to understand the rationale for the provisions, or point to other district plans where those provisions have been used, etc. Anything that can assist us to weigh the benefits of what I'm asking you to provide for us would be appreciated. So if you need more than a day to do that.
Okay, no, I will do that, and we will, Mr. Grady, hear that, and we will take a bit longer to prepare that for you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great. So probably anything within the next fortnight if you can meet that kind of time frame.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. We're also happy to discuss anything with the reporting officer if they would like to.
Yeah, I'm sure we'd appreciate that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Mr. Phillips, are you online?
Yes, good afternoon.
Yep, good afternoon. So I think we only have yourself and Mr. Compton-Moen appearing for the Carter Group. Is that correct?
Lucy Forrester, who's Council, is also online from the looks of things, so she can introduce herself and explain the betting order, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. So we're not seeing her at the moment on the screen.
She's just saying she's unable to unmute herself. If it assists from a timing perspective and without treading on Lucy's toes, I think the plan was to hand simply over to Mr. Compton-Moen in the first instance with his evidence, and then over to myself. So if you wanted to take the initiative in terms of getting underway with Mr. Compton-Moen.
Yeah, normally if council had anything at all to say to us, it'd be normal to have her say that to us first. So,
Yep.
is she going to present to us at all?
Sorry, were you asking a question of me or of Lucy? I think Lucy's just provided a note. I don't know whether you can see it saying no, go ahead. So she's quite happy for things to proceed with Mr. Compton-Moen. I know from the last couple of hearings that I've attended, she hasn't really had much to add other than introducing myself or any other witness. So it appears to be the case here.
All right, thanks. We'll do that then. We'll assume council's in a listening mode. And Mr. Compton-Moen, over to you. Same as before, we've read the evidence. You don't need to read it out to us. If you want to add any additional summary points over and above what you've already told us this morning, you're welcome to do so. And then we'll see if we have questions for you.
No, that's great. Thank you. I was going to read my summary of evidence, but I don't think it would add much value actually, given we've spoken to a number of the aspects already. Just to note though that so looking in particular at the general industrial zone, the port zone, and the large format retail zone, the zone descriptions for each of these zones is notable for their assurance that the amenity values of adjoining zones are maintained, but not within the zones themselves. And I think that points back to what we previously discussed about sensitive and non-sensitive environments, and that ability to have a more permissive structure for signage in those areas where there's potentially no effects. We've talked a lot about on-site and off-site advertising. And again, just regarding the content, we've mentioned about the ability for digital signs to have greater control over their luminance levels, their transitions, and for the ability to to have greater control over them. Any sensitivities really is about those edges from those zones where they adjoin rural and residential areas are the key aspects. And I agree with Mr. Phillips' evidence that that for purpose of the port zone and the general industrial and the large format, that there should be one sign per tenancy allowed. And just to reiterate, though, I do think signage can be a positive aspect to a town, so it shouldn't always be considered a negative aspect, especially in industrial commercial areas. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see if we have questions for you. Mark, any questions from this brief of evidence?
Yes. Looking at your paragraph 23 and 27, a little bit concerned about the transition, the zone boundary really, that you didn't consider the state highway a sensitive environment, and you used the NPD service stations as an example. I'm a little bit concerned that you would seem to suggest that any business establishing along that stretch of Jones Road, for example, could have quite bright, quite illuminated signage, and it wouldn't cause a distraction to the state highway. Is that it? Because it's actually can be argued that it is a distraction. The driver should be concentrating on coming through that highway area towards the traffic lights and should be focusing where they're going, whereas the more bright lights you have off to the side that the driver is attracted to and saying, what's that, is actually a bad thing. I mean, certainly with respect to our discussion about digital signages and their scaling down of their illumination at night, the NPD sites, for example, do not. They seem to be as bright as ever, completely through the night. And I'd be concerned if you're promoting the ability for that whole frontage to be as brightly lit and visible from the highway as that side. Is that your intention, or is that?
Just say that I'm not a traffic engineer, so I don't look at traffic safety or that distraction aspect. I purely look at the fact that the drivers themselves are typically not as sensitive to signage, and from an amenity point of view, they're moving through a zone, they're transitioning. There's a lot of road infrastructure in that environment, which is dissimilar. It's dissimilar to a residential property where they're very sensitive. You know, they open their curtains, they can't move their house. You know, they've if the sign's there and it's right in their face, they can't really do anything about it. Well, a motorist is usually traveling past at high speed, and it's for that reason I consider them a non-sensitive environment.
Right. Because the proposed rules are definitely strong on that not being visible on signage from the highway network, from the residential and rural zones, and that's a very visible transition edge, even though it's quite some distance away.
Yes, and I agree, and that's where on those ones where it is on the edge, you would trigger a resource consent application, but we'd take distance into account and the quality of that view from the residential area back towards the port or the industrial area, and just how that signage fits into that composition.
Thank you.
Raymond, any questions?
No, no questions from me, thank you.
Yeah, Lindsay?
No, nothing additional from me
Just
either.
got 4 matters I just wanted to ask you about. The first one is at your paragraph 8.1. And so you're suggesting that sign R5, in your view, could be a controlled activity. So my question is, in making that recommendation to us, are you saying that you can conceive of no situation whatsoever where an off-site sign should not be consented within those zones?
Yes, I am. It's not. I consider those environments non-sensitive. The industrial areas. So yeah, subject to the other controls, I wouldn't have an issue with that.
And just to clarify, when you say the other controls, you're referring explicitly to what?
Oh, so the I haven't got the rules in front of me, but in terms of the standards, the number of signs allowed per frontage or tenancy would be those standards would, as long as they were met, then I'd say it'd been okay.
So there's specific rule requirement provisions that you were thinking of then when you gave that answer?
Well, I was looking at the Mr. Phillips' evidence. Yeah, I'm fairly sure. There are a number of criteria, and in the Section 42A report, there were some standards and criteria in there.
Okay.
I'm happy to assist with answers either now or when it comes to my evidence on that same point, if that helps you.
Yeah, I think when we come to you, Mr. Phillips, that would be good.
Sure.
Now, my next question was from your paragraph 8.4, and you just said that you don't think that the GIZ, the large format retail zone, and the port zone are sensitive environments. Are amenity considerations still relevant within those zones, though? Surely a well-designed large format retail zone and area is better than one that's not well designed and appropriately landscaped, for example?
Yeah, they're important, but they're not given the importance that we'd have in other zones. I did note from the zone descriptions that it did mention amenity on the edges and their effect on the adjoining zones, but internally, it didn't seem that there was a lot of importance placed on amenity within those zones. There are landscape requirements in there, but they're largely to screen and you could argue that's from amenity point of view, and soften the scale of the buildings. But typically it's a fairly low level of amenity in terms of just providing buffer planting along the edges.
Right. So in terms of your expert evidence to us, are you saying that amenity is relevant within those zones, but it's of a low scale? Is that what you just said?
Yes, yeah, of a low scale.
Yeah.
I don't think if you're assessing an application within that zone for a sign or an activity, amenity probably wouldn't be one of the aspects that would be looked at. In the projects that I've been involved in, typically we're in commercial areas, town centres. Very rarely do we do any work in an industrial zones, just because amenity and visual effects, a lot in rural, obviously landscape effects, but you're not in industrial zones.
So I'm not sure what your evidence to us now is. So within a large format retail zone, for example, is amenity an issue or not an issue with regard to signs?
I think the large format in that respect is probably different from the industrial import zone.
Yeah. And so in terms of what you just said then, so amenity is important within a large format retail zone?
Yeah, it's definitely on a spectrum, isn't it? Because it's
No, I'm just trying to clarify what your evidence to us is.
Yeah. Yes, sorry. Yes, amenity is of a low importance.
Yeah.
In a large format.
Yeah. And obviously you can have poorly designed big box retail that looks kind of ugly, and well-designed big box retail like they have in Frankton and Queenstown that is way less ugly than you see in other places.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Just carrying on in paragraph 8.4. Very last sentence, you say one sign per tenancy is appropriate in your view. That therefore allows an infinite number of signs depending on the number of tenancies on a site. Is that appropriate? Is no limit at all? If there's 100 tenancies on a site, there could be 100 signs. That doesn't seem sensible to me.
No. I understand the rationale for one sign per tenancy, and that ability for, I think as Mr. Daish mentioned before, the on-site versus off-site, advertising the ability for that business to have a sign along its frontage.
Mm-hmm.
I might hand that one over to Mr. Phillips, actually.
No, I'm interested in your opinion as an urban design expert. And my question is it appropriate to allow an infinite number of tenancy signs?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Hopefully that would not occur. But there could be, it's that balance, isn't it? Whether it's could see a large warehouse building that's typically subdivided into smaller tenancies, and each one of those wants a sign in there. And I guess then I don't know if there are any controls over the size of tenancies that are allowed within the zone. Potentially if you could have a 1 square metre tenancy, then we'd be in trouble because you'd have a lot of tenancies in there. But realistically, the tenancies in an industrial area would be large, and hopefully that would be the limiting.
Yeah. So just taking that point on whether or not there should be a limit based on tenancies, if I'm looking at REQ1 and for the large format retail zone, the general industrial zone, the port zone, the maximum area of a sign, and this is a freestanding sign, is 18 square metres. Would it be appropriate to say, well, you can squeeze as many tenancy signs as you like into that 18 square metres, but you shouldn't go any bigger than that, for example?
Yeah, then maybe the length of the frontage comes into play, but
yeah, that's a freestanding
sign.
Yeah.
I think that the 18 square metres is just trying to I think the 18 metres is an appropriate size. I could just imagine some of these lots are large. They may have 100 metre long frontage, and with an industrial area, if they had 3 freestanding signs along that frontage, that would not, I don't think that would be detrimental on the character of that area. Yeah, I guess at some point there's a threshold that we want to avoid, where you do end up with that visual clutter.
Yeah. No, they're the only matters I want to ask you about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Phillips.
Good afternoon. I'll take you through my summary of evidence from paragraph 11 of my evidence that's been pre-circulated, if that suits. Starting there, I note that Appendix 1 to my evidence lists the amendments to the provisions that I consider to be appropriate, accounting for the relief sought by the submitters and the assessment within the officer's report. My evidence provides the reasoning for these amendments. However, in summary, with regards to sign R5 and offsite signs, and accounting for policy sign P5, which seeks that offsite signs are compatible with the character and visual amenity values of the surrounding area, and noting the utilitarian character and amenity of the GIS and LFR zones, I consider that sign R5 should be amended to require consent for offsite signs as a controlled activity where they are not visible from a residential, rural zone or State Highway 1. And they require resource consent as a restricted discretionary activity where they are visible from these locations. In either cases, such applications will be subject to the matters of control or discretion in sign MAT 1, which I consider are appropriate. For sign Rec 1 relating to freestanding signs in the LFRZ that are visible from a residential or rural zone or State Highway 1 should also be subject to rules limiting their quantum area width and height. Otherwise, within that zone, such restrictions are not necessary or appropriate, accounting for the characteristics and low sensitivity of the large format zone and sign policies P1 and P2. Sign Rec 2, signs attached to buildings. For signs attached to buildings in the LFR zone, accounting for the officer's report and Ms. Wolfer's evidence, I consider that these signs should be limited in area to 25% of the primary building frontage area rather than 100% as sought by submitters, or the 2 times building frontage length calculation in sign Rec 2 as it was notified. I also consider and assume that the 25% ratio should apply to the defined term primary building frontage rather than primary building facade, which is not defined. So the latter term primary building facade was referred to in the officer's report. In terms of sign Rec 6, distracting features, for the same reasons expressed in my evidence regarding sign R5 and offsite signs, I consider that sign Rec 6, as it relates to the general industrial zone and the LFR zone, should account for the visibility of such signs from a rural or residential zone or State Highway 1. That is, consent would be required as a controlled activity for digital signs that are not visible from a rural residential zone or State Highway 1, and otherwise consent would be required as a restricted discretionary activity. And again, in both cases, the matters in sign Mat 2 would dictate the extent of control or discretion for such applications. If it assists, as a general comment, perhaps before taking questions and listening to some of the questions, I think of Mr. Gray, where I heard some of his evidence and some of the discussion, I thought it might be useful to note that the submitters sought permitted standards for digital signage in terms of Sign Rec 6. So I think there is a general support for the approach of having permitted standards. I think from a practical point of view, the view was that trying to provide sufficient evidence and justification about those individual standards and triggers as they relate to digital signage would require potentially a reasonable amount of evidence in terms of traffic engineering evidence or evidence from a lighting expert or otherwise. And I guess from that perspective, a pragmatic approach is to say the focus is on a rules framework which accounts for the sensitivity of the location and says, well, those details can be sorted through a consent process through either a controlled activity consenting regime or a restricted discretionary regime. I think I would make the point that from experience that I've had with digital signs, the rules for digital signs tend to have two components. One is a general trigger for where you've got a matter that you think should push an application into requiring consent. So for example, its size or its visibility from a sensitive location like a residential zone would say, well, regardless of the characteristics of the digital sign, you should go through a consenting process. The other part, which is where I think those the standards can be quite useful, is where they actually guide levels of acceptability around digital signage as a medium. So you might have specific controls referring to luminance, maintenance, and attributes like that. And that's been quite helpful in terms of providing users of the plan, be it council officers or applicants or others, with an indication of what's generally deemed to be acceptable in terms of the operating parameters for those digital signs. I think they're largely understood and generally sort of consistently applied. So it just takes out that debate that you might otherwise have at the consent stage, where one council officer or one applicant might assert that a certain luminance standard might be appropriate, and you end up with a lengthy debate over matters that a performance standard can quite usefully guide. So I think it's useful to provide that guidance. I think the approach that I've suggested in my evidence in terms of Appendix 1 is to say, look, that detail would ultimately need to be sorted by consent applicants at the time they make an application, and over time, I guess, as people become familiar with those standards, those issues might get ironed out. I think if the officers had recommended a framework that had standards within it for digital signage, or Go Media, for example, advanced evidence, and the panel were minded to go down that path, I'd be generally supportive of it, but I appreciate that there's an evidential threshold in terms of working through what might be appropriate or not. Happy to answer any questions on that matter or otherwise.
Thank you. Mark, questions?
Yes, I've some concerns about the making of offsite signs as you propose in the industrial zone and large format zone, a controlled activity, in terms of how that is then, if they're essentially allowed subject to the controls, how the environment wouldn't end up with a proliferation of them. In terms of, it almost removes, subject to the controls, the ability to restrict the number. I mean, if you take iPort and iZone, for example, the major roading network is Jones Road and Hoskins Road. And wouldn't people want signage there to direct people into their businesses? And you could end up with those roads quite cluttered with off-site signage pointing people in other directions. And how would that be controlled if it's simply a controlled activity as opposed to a restricted discretionary?
So I think in answering that question, I think it's the way I've looked at it is to say, first and foremost, there seems to be universal agreement about the need to protect sensitive locations, namely residential zones and rural zones, and protect potential effects on the state highway. So for those ones, they're in a different basket. They're automatically into a restricted discretionary consenting framework where you can consider all the relevant matters that are identified and determine whether that's appropriate or not. For other applications, the general premise is that the low sensitivity and amenity of that location is such that it can generally accommodate signage of any nature, whether it's off-site signage, digital signage, freestanding signage, building-related signage. For off-site signage, the suggestion of controlled activity status means that there would be scope to impose conditions over the size or position or height, for example, of signage, accounting for what other signage might be on the site. But I think, again, another key thing here, and particularly relevant to off-site signage and digital signage, is, in my view and from experience, it's a matter that largely self-regulates itself. You've heard from Mr. Gray that, you know, they're obviously looking for eyes on the sign to have a commercial basis to actually put the signage up. So I think, you know, in the quieter or inner parts of, say, an industrial zone where you're going to have relatively low levels of the general public passing by and relatively few eyes, there's unlikely to be much, if at all, any off-site signage, because there's probably no commercial basis to do it. The other aspect of self-regulation is site owners, I guess, balancing getting revenue from off-site signage or digital signage with the revenue and that they get from tenants and keeping tenants happy and meeting tenant needs and through tenant negotiations around signage. So, and part of that is actually ensuring tenants have sufficient signage rights in terms of any area limitations or otherwise to actually be able to offer them signage that they need to advertise their business on the site, but also in terms of competing for attention. So again, that issue of proliferation of signage, even in, you know, retail environments where you might have quite generous signage allowances, the operators, owners of those sites often self-regulate in terms of working out what an appropriate level of signage is to provide suitable exposure for tenants or for off-site signage, and again, not detrimentally affect the level of amenity that they want to achieve. So, and I think that theme will come through in terms of a number of those provisions. So again, going slightly off tangent here, but in terms of the freestanding signage rule, one aspect is to say, no controls, that's potentially opening the door to an infinite number of freestanding signs. How can that be appropriate? But the reality is that self-regulates in terms of where you would put them, how you would put them, what tenants might seek. And so that, in my view, should provide some comfort or supports, I guess, a view that the costs and benefits and the efficiency outcomes of actually intervening with regulation as opposed to leaving it to the market actually in this sort of environment warrants a more relaxed or liberal approach, and like you're saying, well, the likelihood of that occurring is not great, and it's not significant even if it does occur from an amenity perspective. So sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but I think that's probably quite important in terms of that particular issue that you've raised about off-site signage, but I think it flows through the different provisions and the relief that I've suggested in my evidence in Appendix 1.
Yeah, I'm looking at your Appendix 1. I'm still not comforted that your reliance on self-regulation and market forces for particularly arterial roads through these zones is going to work. That perhaps our community expects the greater comfort from a restricted discretionary, that there will be some kind of control over the number and the quantity and quality of the signage, rather than if you're driving through these areas that there's a much bigger number than might be expected of off-site signage. I can understand on-site signage, directing people to the businesses there, but I'd still have a concern that controlled activity status for off-site signage is just a step too far, that it cannot be declined subject to the controls, and makes it difficult to maintain, even if it's a lower level of amenity, but an amenity value in that area for particularly for traffic that's transiting, people that are transiting through those zones, and not be expecting that quantity of signage.
I mean, I respect that and understand that point of view. And again, I think it's just where that on that threshold of permissiveness, the panel ultimately feels comfortable. I mean, I think I would say the controlled activity status provides scope to consider a broad range of matters in terms of traffic safety and amenity and clutter and the characteristics of the site and the particular locality. Obviously, restricted discretionary status does provide greater scope to say, well, look, actually, this just isn't appropriate and we want to decline it, and controlled activity status doesn't provide that. And I guess there's a question there of how far control goes in terms of influencing the outcomes of an application. If it was found that one or more of those assessment matters needed a greater level of intervention, and being comfortable that controlled activity status provides that.
Thank you.
Raymond, any questions?
No, Commissioner Lyle kind of touched on something, and he's clarified that for me. Thank you.
Thanks. And Lindsay?
Mr. Phillips, you would have heard the chair's question to Mr. Compton-Moen about freestanding signs, and should be a tenancy basis as opposed to being next door to the entrance in the large format retail zone. Is that also the general industrial zone?
It probably could apply. I think the relief sought only related to the large format.
The LFRZ, which has a limitation of, well, my understanding from the CMUZ hearings was that there's limitations on retail tenancies of 450 square metres. Is that
well, there are for general retail, but I mean, there's no limitation. For example, there's a smaller limitation for food and beverage, and there's no limitation on other types of activity that are appropriate in that location.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, and what would your response be to the chair's question about you have a number of small tenancies, regardless of what they do in the large format retail zone? Each one of them can have a freestanding sign up to 18 square metres, regardless of whether they should be concentrated at the vehicle entrance. Because most large format retail zones that I'm aware of, and where there's multiple tenancies, have the signage on the tenancies actually on the face of the building, and then at the entrance you actually advertise that there is plumbing, build, or whatever they are. Yep. But you know my point. So
yep.
And with the concern that it's got a pretty permissive activity regime proposed.
Yes. So, I mean, firstly, the relief that I've suggested in Appendix 1 actually says that if freestanding signs in the LFR zone aren't visible from a residential zone, rural zone, or State Highway 1, there is no control height or otherwise. So my view is that those controls in terms of heights and limit of one per axis would only apply in that case. But otherwise, for example, if you have that LFR zone, particularly at iPort, developed like some other large format centres, or probably have a primary vehicle entry point and some secondary vehicle entry points, might have some pedestrian entry points, and that's where I'd come back to the point that this is ultimately something that's self-regulating in terms of what, or from experience, is self-regulating in terms of what actually occurs, because from a commercial perspective, there'll usually be a large freestanding site that might in fact be larger than 18 square metres, or might be higher than 9 metres. Thinking of some of the larger retail complexes around Christchurch or other ones I'm familiar with. So you might have that, and that might be entirely appropriate at that primary vehicle entrance. You might have some smaller pedestrian orientated freestanding signs at pedestrian entry points. I would consider it highly unlikely for an LFR zone or development of that nature to just have a universal amount, or one that relates to one per tenancy. And I think the concern that I had was having one per site doesn't actually allow reasonable flexibility, and will inevitably push someone to a consenting process to get probably a reasonable amount of signage that might relate to vehicle entry points, or freestanding signage that might be within a car parking area or adjacent to a particular building in terms of providing direction to stores. So it comes back to, well, what is the purpose or the overall objective and policy around signage and the sensitivity and amenity of this location? Well, if it's not causing a traffic safety issue and it's not detracting from the overall amenity outcomes, is it justified to intervene and regulate that activity? And like again, the question here is, well, if you don't regulate, the possibility is that you do end up with an infinite number of signs. But I think my view and my experience is that just doesn't practically occur. So does that warrant a regulatory response which will result in the costs and inefficiencies of people going through a consent process, which may ultimately be sort of a waste of time, but unnecessary in terms of the outcomes that they're seeking. So I think either the bar would have to shift in terms of being considerably more permissive, and again, I haven't provided that wording, or it's the liberal approach of I guess having confidence that what will end up on the ground there would be an appropriate outcome in terms of the amenity of that locality.
Yeah, I understand that, but you are proposing a pretty permissive regime in terms of these zones for signage and large signage. 18 square metres is a large sign, and if there is a number of these in relation to a particular site, then it could be a proliferation of signs clutter and so forth, rather than being a well-managed signage response to the urban design outcomes which are anticipated for that zone. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, so I think that's probably the key, is in terms of what are the amenity and design outcomes anticipated for that zone. I think for the general industrial zone, to me, that's quite clear looking at the description of that zone, that it acknowledges a greater level of adverse effects. Talks about noise, odour, traffic volumes, visual dominance and shading from large-scale buildings. There's not really any emphasis or priority afforded to the general industrial zones regarding amenity. So there isn't, to me, a strong policy base to say intervention and regulation is needed around signage to achieve a particular amenity outcome in that location. The large format retail zone doesn't uses different language, or it has a different description. It recognises larger buildings and areas of car parking. To the extent that it does talk about amenity within its description or within its policies, and LFRZ policy 2 is probably the key one. Its focus is on the visual dominance of buildings and landscaping areas along the road frontage. So those outcomes wouldn't necessarily be influenced one way or the other, in my view, significantly by necessarily having larger signs than 18 square metres or 9 metres in height, or having a multiple number of freestanding signs. Again, I appreciate the point that if theoretically an infinite number or an excessive number of freestanding signs occurred, that could potentially detract from that streetscape environment that the LFR zone anticipates. But I think one per site or one per vehicle crossing is potentially sets that bar in an appropriate location. So I think in terms of answering your question, again, kind of done it in a roundabout way, I don't think there is importance placed on amenity for either the large format zone, and definitely not for the general industrial zone, which suggests that a strong regulatory response around freestanding signage is required within the zone as distinct to its edges.
Yeah, I'd just like to just explore a little bit about the expectations of amenity. Back when I first started planning the industrial zones and so forth, there basically anything went. You could put up a 12-metre high building of whatever material. There was no requirement for landscaping of car parks or dealing with that public interface. Obviously, that has moved on in the planning regime since that time, but you're basically saying that there isn't components in those areas which are actually trying to make the site a more pleasant environment, because it is public space when you're talking about the public road. And surely signs would fall within that same category, that there's a minimum level of expectation about design which is required regardless of industrial and large format retail, particularly in relation to the interface in between the site and the road.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that that's there in the district plan as it's been notified in terms of those policies. I think it's clear absolutely clear that the interface with residential and rural zones is of importance. I think in terms of within the zones, I think the message is either not clear, or in terms of the general industrial zone, as I say, I don't think there's a strong direction at all regarding sort of amenity expectations. I think, again, I would acknowledge their large format zone does refer to streetscape values, and I think it's ultimately an urban design call as to where that appropriate bar is for signage within an acceptable streetscape. But again, the large format zone is not, and it's born out of an industrial environment. Again, it's going to have large big boxes. It's going to be inward facing, which again I think is important in terms of that self-regulation. It's probably going to be developed comprehensively. A lot of those things are outside of the plan, of course, and you don't have that control. But again, I think coming back to the message in the plan, there is not a strong direction in terms of the zone descriptions, the objectives or policies for those zones, which to me suggests there's that streetscape environment is something that warrants particular protection. As a general proposition, totally agree that might be a nice outcome to achieve, but I just don't think the plan is pushing that as a key sort of objective or direction that it wants to pursue in those locations.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Just one question for you, Mr. Phillips. You're suggesting in your appendix to your evidence that sign R5 within the GIZ and the LFRZ, the activity status should be controlled. And you suggest to us that the matters of control, this is in your clause 7, would be sign matter 1. Now, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think the plan as notified had any controlled activity rules in the signs chapter. So I'm not convinced that sign matter 1 was drafted with a controlled activity in mind, because a decision maker's assessment is different for a controlled activity than it is for a restricted discretionary activity. For a restricted discretionary activity, there's a lot of subjective assessments are made, and hence sign matter 1, the clauses start with the word whether the scale, design, etc., whether degree. So there's a subjective element there requiring decision maker assessment. I'm not convinced that sign matter 1 is written as appropriate for a controlled activity. For example, if I look at sign matter 1 clause 2, which starts with the word whether, if I was a decision maker looking at a controlled activity, I would expect the whole first line of that clause 2 to be omitted, and it would just go straight to matters like the design, dimensions, nature, etc. So it'd be crystal clear to me what I can and cannot impose conditions on. Whereas the way it's written now, it's not crystal clear to me that I would have scope to impose conditions on those things. It just asks me to make a whether or not assessment. Do you have a comment on that?
Fair point. I think, put simply, I think I'd agree. I mean, and whether that's laziness on my part or just putting, I guess, trust in the process that it'll sort that out. But I think, actually, in fairness, that I take the point, and I'd agree again. The example that you've given in terms of matter 1.2. I'd agree that would be clear as a controlled activity status with that first line omitted and it cutting straight to the chase in terms of A through F. So if that's something that we could would assist the panel in terms of us revisiting how that might be worded, that's probably not a difficult exercise, because again, I think my key view is I think the substance of what would need to be considered is there, but I take the point that if it's been drafted, it hasn't been drafted with that in mind, and there's probably room for improvement.
Yeah, if you're happy to do that, so then obviously when we hear back from our 42A reporting officers, they can look at that, and then we can have that in front of us as well. So if you're able to do that, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Certainly.
And that was the only thing I wanted to take up with you, but my colleague has one further question for you, Mark.
Thank you. In your recommended changes, and I understand that you're appearing on behalf of a particular area, you keep referring to State Highway 1. Wouldn't it be better to have that as a state highway? Because we may have industrial zones, for example, that border other state highways, not just State Highway 1. So one's got a number of state highways that cross it. So wouldn't it, if we were to adopt your recommended changes, through a reference to a state highway rather than a specific state highway within Selwyn?
Yes, I mean, without being familiar off the top of my head of what other state highways that might apply to in terms of other industrial zones, Obviously, the LFR zone, the only state highway in proximity is State Highway 1, and certainly the general industrial zone for iZone and iPort is State Highway 1. In terms of other ones within the district, though, it's a fair point. I think the only thing I would just caution about in terms of broadening it to state highways generally is whether the sort of high speed, lower speed state highway environments needs distinction. So from experience, state NZTA have a particular concern, and there's usually rules and other district plans that place greater importance on state highways with a speed limit of 70 kilometres or over. Whereas if you've got a low speed state highway, that might be less of an issue. So I think the point you're making is, should it just be State Highway 1 or should it include other higher speed state highways? I'd probably say yes. So I think, sorry, I'm coming to an answer. I think maybe if the wording was relating to state highways with a speed limit of above 70 kilometres per hour, I would support that. I think that, yeah.
Yeah, that's just looking at the future of the district plan. If it was to last its 10 years, we want it to be as broad as possible, get their balance right between being specific and being broad. That I can think of industrial area on the fringe of Darfield on that State Highway 73 that probably would potentially qualify under the rules that you suggest. And it's not State Highway 1, it's State Highway 73. It is in a 70k zone. Therefore, if your amendments were adopted, they should probably apply there. That's just one example I can think of, so that it's not as tying it to as specific and looking for the future of someone as we grow. Who knows? We may have another large format retail zone and so on at some point.
Certainly. Yep.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Phillips, I think that's the end of our questions. Thanks very much for appearing and answering our questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And in terms of that little bit of further work you're going to do, I'm not sure if you were online earlier, but for other submitters today, I've suggested a time frame of around about a fortnight, if you can meet that kind of time frame as well.
No problems at all.
Excellent. Right, thanks very much. So now, just before I adjourn this hearing, I just want to check with the panel if there's any particular matters I'd like the 42A reporting team to include in their reply report. Mark, anything specific you'd like the officers to address for us? Raymond?
No, thank you.
Lindsay?
The issue we've been traversing with Mr. Phillips in terms of control versus restricted discretionary, something that interests me particularly about whether the matters themselves can remain as they are in their current wording with that regime. But I think the rest should be fairly self-evident.
Just two matters for me. Obviously, we received tabled evidence from submitters who haven't wished to appear today, but nevertheless, that evidence is just as important as the evidence from people who have appeared. And so in terms of the tabled evidence of Waka Kotahi, in the reply report, can you specifically address the issue they raised, which was to have a minimum font size for signs on the state highway included in REQ7? And they provided rationale for that and said, well, that happens in other areas. So could you specifically give us a point of view on that? And if you agree with them, obviously appropriate wording. And then just to confirm with you that you're happy to work with the Go Media representatives on these bespoke provisions that I asked to be drafted so we can have an option in front of us. So you're happy to work with them on that? Absolutely. All right, thanks very much. So with that, we'll adjourn the hearing. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.